Good morning, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. I am very grateful for your invitation to speak today and to return to Slovenia for the 5th occasion. My last visit here was a mountain tour which finished on the summit of your highest peak, Triglav. Today, instead of expending a great deal of physical energy, I'm here to talk about the subject. Despite the urgency of fighting hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there is a great deal of scepticism as to whether the world, especially developed countries, are moving fast enough and have both the determinations and the means to meet their climate goals. Only this week, a damning report at the G20 summit was published showing that not a single country is currently on track to meet its own targets. However, I see compelling grounds for optimism and want to use my time this morning to convince you that 6 critical drivers will together ensure the success of the war against climate change. It is an exciting story, and I hope at the end of the presentation you will see how it can all work. But first, we need to appreciate the magnitude of the challenge facing us. We are currently deeply embedded in a comprehensive fossil fuel infrastructure which stretches from the sources of fuel production along the transport lines to refineries and power stations and ultimately to the facilities which use these fuels, motor vehicles, domestic and industrial boilers, and other industrial processes. Over the next 30 years, the world needs to move out of this infrastructure into an essentially very different infrastructure designed to produce, transport, and use clean energy. Truly a mammoth task. If we look at the current metrics of our energy world, they do not make good reading. We are currently emitting 4 to 5 times the level of greenhouse gases that is required to limit global warming. Our economy is heavily dependent upon fossil fuels, and the move into renewables is not proceeding at all at the necessary rate. In several European countries, the building of onshore wind has virtually ground to a halt. Our energy system and some of the facilities using it, in particular private vehicles, have an unacceptably low level of utilisation. The average car is used for only 5% of the time, and the utilisation of power systems is at best around 50%. Overall, this means poor use of capital, and also that a great deal more steel, copper and plastics need to be produced than would be necessary with higher energy system utilisation. Efforts to increase the utilisation of the power system and in parallel to move more generally to a shared economy, in particular for transport, will be an important step to reducing industrial production requirements and therefore directly reducing industrial emissions. On top of this, we are facing 3 more problems. A low level of recycling, generally inadequate public transport systems which discourage a move away from private cars, and lastly, a low level of electrification. I mention that since electrification will certainly be the key to the necessary move into much more clean energy. Against this depressing background, I now come to the 6 drivers which collectively will lift us out of the current high carbon world into the new clean energy infrastructure. Number 1 is the role of the European Commission, which was already in 2007 the first multinational government in the world to introduce a clear emission reduction goal, the famous 20-20-20 programme, which is running to 2020 and overall on track to meet its goals. The new Commission President, Frau von der Leyen, is a very determined leader and will shortly be setting out an ambitious Green Deal aiming for a further 30 to 35% emissions reductions over the coming decade and backed by a high proportion of the new European budget. Next come the ambitions of certain individual countries, some of which already have laws to require climate neutrality in 2050 and whose citizens are clamouring for much more effort. I would put numbers 5 and 6 together under corporate stakeholder requirements, where financial institutions are in the driving seat. Both on grounds of social responsibility and also to ensure the best long-term returns on their investments, they are steadily transferring funds out of fossil fuel-based activities into those using clean fuels. This puts pressure on manufacturing and service companies to reduce their CO2 footprint, which they are steadily undertaking by first moving to green electricity and then giving attention to reducing emissions along their whole supply chain. It is nothing less than a start of the new industrial revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, of all things, it is money which speaks most clearly. When investors right around the world, including sovereign wealth funds, are no longer prepared to support any fossil fuel-based activity, it will become very difficult to find new money for any new sources of fossil fuels or processes based on them. But lastly, what in my view will really ensure the success of the necessary energy transitions will be further technology advance. Already within the last 10 years, we've seen the most amazing cost reductions in PV panels and wind plants both on and offshore. As compared to their mature fossil fuel counterparts, the technology here is very young and still has plenty of scope for progress. The costs for batteries and electrolysis will surely fall much further, collectively helping to make clean energy the cheapest form of energy so that it will become the energy of choice. The oil producers will see how quickly their demand for product declines as electric vehicles take hold all around the world. They will need to replace their oil revenue with revenue from new sources, but luckily have sun-bathed deserts which will enable some of the largest and lowest cost sources of renewables energy around the world. These will be natural locations for the production of synthetic fuels, and I expect a whole new global trade to emerge based on these, which fortunately will be able to make use of the existing oil and gas transport infrastructure. I hope that you agree with me that these 6 drivers form a very powerful combination. Of course, they will be further helped by tax breaks and other regulations. In summary, I hope that my arguments have helped convince you that the war of climate change can be won, and in the words of Barack Obama, yes, we can. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. I'll now be happy to answer any questions.